Running on Time. Based on the Railway series by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, and Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends by Britt Allcroft and David Mitten. While Thomas was at the works following his breakdown, Toby, Percy, Mavis and Daisy took care of the line. Since the quarry was due to be closed for rock blasting, Mavis would sometimes help with shunting at the harbour. Toby's passenger services were scheduled more often in place of some of his goods trains, and Percy and Daisy took it in turns to take out Annie and Clarabelle to collect Thomas's passengers. "It's always the same when it's like this," they grumbled. "We don't know whether we're coming or going." "Never mind," beamed Percy. "Things will settle down when Thomas comes back." Even Bertie the bus found himself picking up more and more passengers in Thomas's absence. Altogether, it was becoming apparent to everyone that another temporary engine was needed to run the line. To counter this, the Fat Controller had brought in Duck the Great Western engine to help with the extra traffic. He bustled up and down the line, doing all his tasks right on time and without any fuss. Toby, Percy, Mavis and Daisy were glad of his help, but he wouldn't stop talking about the Great Western Way, and wasn't shy in letting them know when they were running late. One day, Toby was getting steam up in the yard. He had a busy morning ahead of him. First, he had to take the workmen to the quarry aboard Henrietta as usual. Then, he had to take some stone trucks to the harbour. After that, he needed to take some coal trucks to Farquhar before he took the Vintage on its first passenger train of the day. Usually, Percy would have taken the coal trucks, but he was already out with Annie and Clarabelle, so Toby had to take over from him. He buffered gently up to Henrietta, and they pulled out of the carriage sheds to pick up the workmen. As they trundled along the lane towards the quarry, Henrietta began to feel strange. "My brake blocks feel stiff," she moaned. "I'm sure the workmen oiled them up this morning." "That sounds strange," Toby pondered. "I'll ask Driver to take a look when we have time." But they didn't. No sooner had he taken the trucks and come back for her, than it was time for Toby to prepare the Vintage. "Oh dear," groaned Henrietta. "I can't possibly go out, not like this." "I'm sorry, Henrietta," Toby said sadly, "but Annie and Clarabelle are already out with Percy today, and we can't let the passengers down." "I know," sighed Henrietta, "but I'm just worried that something may happen." And she was right. Toby pulled the Vintage into the platform at Farquhar. Lots of passengers crowded round him, Henrietta, Victoria and Elsie, taking photographs and talking to them. Henrietta did her best to hide her worried, pained expression, and did it well too, for not a single passenger seemed to notice the problems she was having. The porter and the guard loaded the passengers' luggage aboard Elsie, and Victoria and Henrietta soon found themselves full of excited passengers. Toby rang his bell and they started off. Toby trundled gently along the line. There was no need to hurry. He rode smoothly and was making good time at all the stations. The journey to Knapford was pleasant and uninterrupted. The journey up to Ulfstead, however, was due to be a different matter altogether. Recently, Toby and the Vintage had been refitted with vacuum brakes. These allow the driver to set the brakes on the whole train simultaneously by sucking the air out of the brake pipes, thus either setting brakes for the whole train on or releasing them when needed. These were added to prevent any runaways for the uphill journey. If the vacuum brakes failed, the whole train would be brought to a stop. Toby pulled in at Hackenbeck and let the passengers disembark. When some more had boarded the train and it was time to leave, the guard blew his whistle and waved his green flag. Toby rang his bell and tried to start, but he couldn't. His driver tried releasing the vacuum brakes, but nothing happened. There was no pressure in the gauge. Something's not right, Toby muttered to himself. Ah! Screeched Henrietta in pain. I told you! My brakes are jammed on now! I can't move! The driver and guard checked her all over, while the fireman stayed in Toby's cab. I'll try releasing the brakes, Ron, offered the fireman, and he did so. No luck, Cecil, the driver replied. What do you think, Reggie? Well, I don't know, said the guard. I've not had this happen before. Couldn't you try levering it open with something? Suggested Toby. One of my old drivers did that back when I worked at the docks at Great Yarmouth. Whenever one of our trucks slipped their brakes on, he usually levered them off with a crowbar. That's a good idea, Toby, said the driver, but we haven't got a crowbar. Well, then I'll just have to force Henrietta's brakes off by hand, said the guard. She's small enough, and I can see her brake blocks. He jumped down into the gap between Henrietta and the platform. Toby, his driver and fireman, and the passengers waited. They were all worried. The train was now late, and they were blocking Percy with his trucks for the quarry. At last, the guard emerged. Sorry about that, he said. I had to kick it off with my foot. Never mind, said the driver. At least they're off. But now we'll just have to try and make up for lost time, Toby. And I'm afraid we'll have to leave Henrietta in the shed at Farquhar after this journey until we can get her mended. I'm sorry, old boy. So am I, said Toby sadly. This time they managed to set off without any mishap. But Toby couldn't go fast. Too much force on stopping could jam Henrietta's brakes on again, and he didn't want to have an accident. So, as much as he tried to arrive on time, he was still 5 minutes late when he finished his journey at Ulfstead. Sadly, he took her back down the line to Farquhar and left her in the carriage works before shunting over to the water column. Mavis brought down some loaded stone trucks for Duck to take to the harbour. The quarry had finished its rock blasting, and there was plenty of stone to be taken away. She noticed Toby's sad expression on his face. Don't worry, Toby, she said. It shouldn't take the workmen long to repair Henrietta. I know, Mavis, Toby sighed, but I just don't like being away from her for long. Just then, Duck puffed into the yard light engine. 5 minutes late, he tutted. Not very efficient, Toby. Don't blame them, Mavis retorted crossly. Poor Henrietta can't help it if her brakes failed. That's no excuse, Mavis, Duck replied. This is a branch line, not a heritage line. If this was a Great Western branch line, there would be no delays. Toby groaned. Here it comes, he muttered to himself. There are two ways of doing things, continued Duck. The Great Western way or the wrong way. I'm Great Western and I'm Great Eastern, cut in Toby. But you don't see me boasting about it. Well, I'm only saying, continued Duck, slightly hurt, that you should try and be a little bit more efficient yourself. Toby had had a trying enough day, and could feel his patience beginning to wane a little. Like the other engines, he had great respect for Duck, but especially considering his own Great Eastern Railway background, and the fact that they were once rivals with the GWR, he too was not taken in by the latter's preference for the Great Western way. He opened his mouth to explain what had really happened that morning to Duck, but the pannier tank had already buffered up to his stone trucks and puffed away. I don't know what's going on with this branch line, Duck said as he clattered down the line with his train of loaded trucks. On the Little Western, we never have any delays. Oh, I don't know, replied the driver. What about Oliver's racist passenger? Or that business with Bulgy the double-decker? Well, I know I wasn't responsible for any delays, protested Duck. And yet you blocked the big engines from the sheds when you first arrived and crashed into the barber shop, the driver corrected. But the big engines were asking for it treating Percy like that, Duck argued. And you know full well it was better I crashed into the barber shop than into another train. Even so, the driver remarked, you shouldn't be so hypocritical to the other engines. I know you're proud of being Great Western, but even you are prone to causing some delays yourself. Besides, he and Henrietta are older than you, and can't help it if they suffer damage or delays more easily. Remarked Duck thoughtfully. He now felt guilty about what he had said to Toby, and began to think about how he could apologise to him when they next met. He was so preoccupied in his own thoughts that he forgot what he was supposed to be doing. At Dryor, a meat van stood on a siding. It had been loaded up and was ready to be sent to Knapford, where Henry would take it to Vicarstown on his slow goods. Duck was supposed to stop at the station and shunt it onto his train, before carrying on to Knapford Harbour himself. He approached the station with increasing speed. The station master was patrolling the platform when he saw Duck sail towards the platform at an alarming speed. He's not going to stop in time, he gasped. Acting quickly, he picked up his red flag and ran towards the edge of the platform, waving it frantically in the air. Stop, he cried, you're going too fast! Immediately the driver saw this and applied the brakes hard. Duck was jolted out of his thoughts by the screeching of his brakes as his wheels skidded along the rails. Ow, 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 ow! Screamed the trucks as they banged into his buffers, propelling him further along the platform. Duck tried hard to stop, but couldn't help himself from gliding right through the station. Still waving his flag in a panic, the station master ran alongside him, trying to get him to stop. Duck looked on in horror. The signal ahead of him was set to danger. Every wise engine knows never to pass a signal that is set against them. He pushed back harder against the surging trucks. I must stop, he groaned. But it was no use. Duck's train ran right through the station, only stopping when the brake van cleared the signal box at the other end. He looked wearily about him. The signalman shook his fist crossly at him. The station master looked as though he was going to turn into a tomato. His face was red with fury. Meekly, Duck brought his train back to the platform. The station master was furious. You clumsy great engine, he seethed. You know full well never to run through your stops, and you've passed the signal at danger too. I've had to delay Toby and Daisy's passenger services just to get you back here. You're lucky you still need to pick up that goods van, or I would have had you taken off the train, Duck. Duck gulped and looked all about him. The passengers were all crowding round him, telling him what a bad engine he was. He wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't his fault. But then he realised something. This was exactly how he had made Toby feel. With a sigh, Duck picked up the meat van, shunted it onto his train, and carried on his journey. He half hoped no one else would hear of this, but the story soon spread. When Duck returned to the sheds at Farquhar that evening, he could hear Toby and Mavis chuckling to each other. I hear someone ran right through the platform at Dryor, Toby, Mavis grinned. Any idea who it might be? No, said Toby, but I doubt it could have been Duck. He's never late. If he was on a Great Western branch line, he'd see to it that no one was either. There are two ways of doing things, the Great Western way or the wrong way. He's Great Western, and even I am prone to delays, I suppose. Duck smiled ruefully as he backed down towards the coaling stage. I'm sorry I was so rude to you, Toby, he continued, a sincere look in his eyes. I suppose my accident served me right for boasting so much. That's all right, Duck, said Toby. We all make rash judgments sometimes. The best thing to do is to take into account all the reasons why these things happen. Indeed, said the Fat Controller. He had just arrived at the sheds. I came to inform you all that Thomas's repairs have been completed right on time, and he is due to return home tomorrow. It wouldn't be very, efficient of us to have him arrive back any later, would it, Doc? Great Western or Great Eastern, we all have our way of doing things, and we all have our values. I hope you realize that there's more ways of doing things than the Great Western way by now. It wouldn't be very Great Western of you to do otherwise now, would it? Everyone laughed, even Duck. No, sir, he chuckled before adding to no one in particular. But I still prefer the Great Western way any day.